Welcome back to Chapter 2 of our epic journey through American Prometheus. In this installment, we dive even deeper into the compelling narrative of our American hero. Chapter 1 laid the groundwork, but now it's time to uncover more of the dramatic twists and turns in their extraordinary life. Get ready for a closer look at the challenges, victories, and the essence of what makes American Prometheus a true legend in American history. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss a moment of this captivating story. Without further ado, let's turn the page and continue our exploration of American Prometheus.
Chapter 2: His Separate Prison. The notion that I was traveling down a clear track would be wrong. Robert Oppenheimer. In September 1922, Robert Oppenheimer enrolled at Harvard. Although the university awarded him a fellowship, but he didn't accept it because I could get along well without the money. Instead of the scholarship, Harvard gave him a volume of Galileo's early writings. He was assigned a single room in Standish Hall, a freshman dormitory facing the Charles River. At 19, Robert was an oddly handsome young man. Every feature of his body was extreme. His fine, pale skin was drawn taut across high cheekbones. His eyes were the brightest pale blue, but his eyebrows were glossy black. He wore his coarse, kinky black hair long on top, but short at the sides, so he seemed even taller than his lanky, 5-foot, 10-inch frame. He weighed so little, never more than 130 pounds, that he gave an impression of flimsiness. His straight Roman nose, thin lips, and large, almost pointed ears accentuated an image of exaggerated delicacy. He spoke in fully grammatical sentences with the kind of ornate European politeness his mother had taught him. But as he talked, his long, thin hands made his gestures seem somehow contorted. His appearance was mesmerizing and slightly bizarre. His behavior in Cambridge over the next 3 years did nothing to soften the impression his appearance gave of a studious, socially inept, and immature young man. As surely as New Mexico had opened up Robert's personality, Cambridge drove him back to his former introversion. At Harvard, his intellect thrived, but his social development floundered, or so it seemed to those who knew him. Harvard was an intellectual bazaar filled with delights for the mind, but it offered Robert none of the careful guidance and devoted nurturing of his ethical culture experience. He was on his own, and so he retreated into the security his powerful intellect assured. He seemed incapable of not flaunting his eccentricities. His diet often consisted of little more than chocolate, beer, and artichokes. Lunch was often just a black and tan, a piece of toast slathered with peanut butter and topped with chocolate syrup. Most of his classmates thought him diffident. Fortunately, both Francis Ferguson and Paul Horgan were also at Harvard that year, so he had at least 2 soulmates. But he made very few new friends. One was Jeffries Wyman, a Boston Brahmin who was beginning graduate studies in biology. He, Robert, found social adjustment very difficult, Wyman recalled, and I think he was often very unhappy. I suppose he was lonely and felt he didn't fit in well. We were good friends, and he had some other friends, but there was something that he lacked. Because our contacts were large, I should say wholly, on an intellectual basis. Introverted and intellectual, Robert was already reading such dark-spirited writers, such as Chekhov and Catherine Mansfield. His favorite Shakespearean character was Hamlet. Horgan recalled years later that Robert had bouts of melancholy, deep depressions as a youngster. He would seem to be incommunicado emotionally for a day or two at a time. That happened while I was staying with him once or twice, and I was very distressed and had no idea what was causing it. Sometimes Robert's flair for the intellectual went beyond the merely ostentatious. Wyman recalled a hot spring day when Oppenheimer walked into his room and said, "What intolerable heat. I have been spending all afternoon lying on my bed, reading Jean's dynamical theory of gases. What else can one do in weather like this?" 40 years later, Oppenheimer still had in his possession a weathered and salt-encrusted copy of James Hopwood Jeans's book, Electricity and Magnetism. In the spring of Robert's freshman year, he formed a friendship with Frederick Bernheim, a pre-med student who had graduated from the Ethical Culture School a year after him. They shared an interest in science, and with Ferguson about to leave for England on a Rhodes Scholarship, Robert soon anointed Bernheim as his new best friend. Unlike most college-age men, who tend to have many acquaintances and few deep friendships, Robert's friendships were few and intense. In September 1923, at the beginning of their sophomore year, he and Bernheim decided to share adjacent rooms in an old house at 60 Mount Auburn Street, close to the offices of the Harvard Crimson. Robert decorated his room with an oriental rug, oil paintings, and etchings he brought from home, and insisted on making tea from a charcoal-fired Russian samovar. Bernheim was more amused than annoyed by his friend's eccentricities. He wasn't a comfortable person to be around, in a way, because he always gave the impression that he was thinking very deeply about things. When we roomed together, he would spend evenings locked in his room, trying to do something with Planck's constant, or something like that. I had visions of him suddenly bursting forth as a great physicist. And here I was, just trying to get through Harvard. Bernheim thought Robert was something of a hypochondriac. He went to bed with an electric pad every night, and one day it started to smoke. Robert woke up and ran to the bathroom with the burning pad. He then went back to sleep, unaware that the pad was still burning. Bernheim recalled having to put the thing out before it burned the house down. Living with Robert was always a little bit of a strain, Bernheim noted, because you had to more or less adjust to his standards or moods. He was the dominant one. Difficult or not, Bernheim roomed with Robert for their 2 remaining years at Harvard and credited him with inspiring his later career in medical research. Only one other Harvard student dropped by their Mount Auburn Street quarters with any regularity. William Clouser Boyd had met Robert in chemistry class one day and took an instant liking to him. We had lots of interests in common aside from science, he recalled. They both tried to write poetry, sometimes in French, and short stories imitative of Chekhov. Robert always called him Clouser, purposely misspelling his middle name. Clouser often joined Robert and Fred Bernheim on occasional weekend expeditions to Cape Ann, an hour's drive northeast of Boston. Robert didn't yet know how to drive, so the boys would go in Bernheim's Willys Overland and spend the night at an inn in Folly Cove outside of Gloucester, where the food was particularly good. Boyd would finish Harvard in 3 years, and like Robert, he worked hard to do it. But while Robert spent many long hours in his room studying, Boyd remembers that he was pretty careful not to let you catch him at it. He thought Robert could run circles around him intellectually. He had a very quick mind. For instance, when someone would propose a problem, he would give 2 or 3 wrong answers, followed by the right one, before I could think of a single answer. The one thing Boyd and Oppenheimer did not have in common was music. I was very fond of music, Boyd recalled. But once a year, he would go to an opera, with me and Bernheim usually, and he'd leave after the first act. He just couldn't take any more. Herbert Smith had also noticed this peculiarity, and once said to Robert, "You're the only physicist I've ever known who wasn't also musical." Initially, Robert was not sure which academic path he should choose. He took a variety of unrelated courses, including philosophy, French literature, English, introductory calculus, history, and 3 chemistry courses: qualitative analysis, gas analysis, and organic chemistry. He briefly considered architecture, but because he had loved Greek in high school, he also toyed with the thought of becoming a classicist, or even a poet or painter. The notion that I was traveling down a clear track, he recalled, would be wrong. But within months, he settled on his first passion, chemistry, as a major. Determined to graduate in 3 years, he took the maximum number of allowed courses, 6. But each semester, he also managed to audit 2 or 3 others. With virtually no social life, he studied long hours, though he made an effort to hide the fact, because somehow it was important to him that his brilliance appear effortless. He read all 3,000 pages of Gibbon's classic history, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He also read widely in French literature and began writing poetry, a few examples of which appeared in Hound and Horn, a student journal. "When I am inspired," he wrote Herbert Smith, "I jot down verses. As you so neatly remarked, they aren't either meant or fit for anyone's perusal, and to force their masturbatic excesses on others is a crime. But I shall stuff them in a drawer for a while, and, if you want to see them, send them off." That year, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land was published, and when Robert read it, he instantly identified with the poet's sparse existentialism. His poetry dwelt with themes of sadness and loneliness. Early in his tenure at Harvard, he wrote these lines: "The dawn invests our substance with desire, and the slow light betrays us and our wistfulness. When the celestial essay from is faded and grown colorless, and the sun gone sterile, and the growing fire stirs us to waken, we find ourselves again, each in his separate prison, ready, hopeless for negotiation with other men." Harvard's political culture in the early 1920s was decidedly conservative. Soon after Robert's arrival, the university imposed a quota to restrict the number of Jewish students. By 1922, the Jewish student population had risen to 21%. In 1924, the Harvard Crimson reported on its front page that the university's former president, Charles W. Eliot, had publicly declared it unfortunate that growing numbers of the Jewish race were intermarrying with Christians. Few such marriages, he said, turned out well. And because biologists had determined that Jews are prepotent, the children of such marriages will look like Jews only. While Harvard accepted a few Negroes, President A. Lawrence Lowell staunchly refused to allow them to reside in the freshman dormitories with whites. Oppenheimer was not oblivious to these issues. Indeed, early that autumn of 1922, he joined the Student Liberal Club, founded 3 years earlier as a forum for students to discuss politics and current events. In In its early years, the club attracted large audiences with such speakers as the liberal journalist Lincoln Steffens, Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor, and the pacifist A.J. Most. In March 1923, the club took a formal stand against the university's discriminatory admissions policies. Though it cultivated a reputation for radical views, Robert was not impressed and wrote to Smith of the asinine pomposity of the Liberal Club. In this, his first introduction to organized politics, he felt himself very much a fish out of water. Nevertheless, lunching one day at the club's rooms at 66 Winthrop Street, he was introduced to a senior, John Edsel, who quickly convinced him to help edit a new student journal. Drawing on his Greek, he persuaded Edsel to call the journal The Gadfly. The title page reproduced a quotation in Greek describing Socrates as the gadfly of the Athenians. The first issue of The Gadfly came out in December 1922, and Robert was listed on its masthead as an associate editor. He remembered writing a few unsigned articles, but The Gadfly did not become a permanent fixture on campus, and only 4 issues survive. However, Robert's friendship with Edsel continued. By the end of his freshman year at Harvard, Robert decided that he had made a mistake in selecting chemistry as his major. "I can't recall how it came over me that what I liked in chemistry was very close to physics," Oppenheimer said. "It's obvious that if you were reading physical chemistry and you began to run into thermodynamical and statistical mechanical ideas, you'd want to find out about them. It's a very odd picture. I never had an elementary physics course." Though committed to a chemistry major, that spring he petitioned the physics department for graduate standing, which would allow him to take upper-level physics courses. To demonstrate that he knew something about physics, he listed 15 books he claimed to have read. Years later, he heard that when the faculty committee met to consider his petition, one professor, George Washington Pierce, quipped, "Obviously, if Oppenheimer says he's read these books, he's a liar, but he should get a PhD for knowing their titles." His primary tutor in physics became Percy Bridgman, 1882-1961, who later won a Nobel Prize. "I found Bridgman a wonderful teacher," Oppenheimer remembered, "because he never really was quite reconciled to things being the way they were, and he always thought them out." "A very intelligent student," Bridgman later said of Oppenheimer. "He knew enough to ask questions." But when Bridgman assigned him a lab experiment that required making a copper-nickel alloy in a self-built furnace, Oppenheimer didn't know one end of the soldering iron from the other. Oppenheimer was so clumsy with the lab's galvanometer that its delicate suspensions had to be replaced every time he used the apparatus. Robert, nevertheless, showed persistence, and Bridgman found the results interesting enough to publish them in a scientific journal. Robert was both precocious and, on occasion, irritatingly brash. One evening, Bridgman invited him to his home for tea. In the course of the evening, the professor showed his student a photograph of a temple built, he said, about 400 BC in Segesta, Sicily. Oppenheimer quickly disagreed. "I judge from the capitals on the columns that it was built about 50 years earlier." When the famous Danish physicist Niels Bohr gave 2 lectures at Harvard in October 1923, Robert made a point of attending both. Bohr had just won the Nobel the previous year for his investigations of the structure of atoms and of the radiation emanating from them. Oppenheimer would later say that it would be hard to exaggerate how much I venerate Bohr. Even on this occasion, his first glimpse of the man, he was deeply moved. Afterward, Professor Bridgman noted that the impression Bohr made on everyone who met him was a singularly pleasant one, personally. I have seldom met a man with such evident singleness of purpose, and so apparently free from guile. He is now idolized as a scientific god through most of Europe. Oppenheimer's approach to learning physics was eclectic, even haphazard. He focused on the most interesting, abstract problems in the field, bypassing the dreary basics. Years later, he confessed to feeling insecure about the gaps in his knowledge. To this day, he told an interviewer in 1963, "I get panicky when I think about a smoke ring or elastic vibrations. There's nothing there, just a little skin over a hole." In the same way, my mathematical formation was, even for those days, very primitive. I took a course from J.E. Littlewood on number theory. Well, that was nice, but that wasn't really how to go about learning mathematics for the professional pursuit of physics. When Alfred North Whitehead arrived on campus, only Robert and one other undergraduate dared to sign up for a course with the philosopher and mathematician. They painstakingly worked their way through the 3 volumes of Principia Mathematica, co-authored by Whitehead and Bertrand Russell. "I had a very exciting time," Oppenheimer recalled, reading the Principia with Whitehead, who had forgotten it so that he was both teacher and student. Despite this experience, Oppenheimer always thought he was deficient in mathematics. "I never did learn very much. I probably learned a good deal by a method that is never given enough credit. That is, by being with people. I should have learned more mathematics. I think I would have enjoyed it, but it was a part of my impatience that I was careless about it." But if there were gaps in his education, he could admit to his friend Paul Horgan that Harvard was good for him. In the autumn of 1923, Robert wrote Horgan a satirical letter in which he wrote about himself in the third person. "Oppenheimer has grown to be quite a man. Now you have no idea how Harvard has changed him. I am afraid it is not for the good of his soul to study so hard. He says the most terrible things. Only the other night I was arguing with him, and I said, 'But you believe in God, don't you?' And he said, 'I believe in the second law of thermodynamics, in Hamilton's principle, in Bertrand Russell, and would you believe it, Siegfried, Freud.' Horgan thought Robert enthralling and charming. Horgan was himself a brilliant young man, and in the course of his long life, he would eventually write 17 novels and 20 works of history, winning the Pulitzer Prize twice. But he would always regard Oppenheimer as a rare and invaluable polymath. "Leonardos and Oppenheimer are scarce," Horgan wrote in 1988. "But their wonderful love and projection of understanding as both private connoisseurs and historical achievers offer us at least an ideal to consider and measure by." Throughout his years at Harvard, Robert kept up a frequent correspondence with his ethical culture school teacher and New Mexico guide, Herbert Smith. In the winter of 1923, he tried to convey with elaborate irony what his life was like at Harvard. "Generously, you ask what I do," Oppenheimer wrote Smith. "Aside from the activities exposed in last week's disgusting note, I labor and write innumerable theses, notes, poems, stories, and junk. I go to Math Library and read, and to the Philosophy Lib, and divide my time between Minher, Bertrand Russell, and the contemplation of a most beautiful and lovely lady who is writing a thesis on Spinoza. Charmingly ironic at that, don't you think? I make stenches in 3 different labs. Listen to Professor Louis Allard gossip about Racine, serve tea, and talk learnedly to a few lost souls. Go off for the weekend to distill low-grade energy into laughter and exhaustion. Read Greek, commit faux pas, search my desk for letters, and wish I were dead. Voila. Dark wit aside, Robert still suffered periodic bouts of depression. Some of these episodes were brought on by his family's visits to Cambridge. Ferguson remembers going out to dinner with Robert and some of his relatives, not his parents, and watching as his friend turned visibly green from the strain of being polite. Afterward, Robert would drag Ferguson with him as he pounded the pavement for miles, talking all the while in his quiet, even voice about some physics problem. Walking was his only therapy. Fred Bernheim recalled hiking one winter night until 3 a.m. On one of these cold winter walks, someone dared the boys to jump in the river. Robert and at least one of his friends stripped and plunged into the icy water. In retrospect, all of his friends noted that he seemed to be wrestling in these years with inner demons. My feeling about myself, Oppenheimer later said of this period in his life, was always one of extreme discontent. I had very little sensitivity to human beings and very little humility before the realities of this world. Unfulfilled sexual desires certainly lay behind some of Robert's troubles. At the age of 20, he was not alone, of course. Few of his friends had a social life that included women, and none of them remember Robert ever taking a woman on a date. Wyman recalled that he and Robert were too much in love with intellectual life to be thinking about girls. We were all going through a series of love affairs with ideas. But perhaps we lacked some of the more mundane forms of love affairs that make life easier. Robert certainly felt a welter of sensuous desires, as evidenced by some of the decidedly erotic poetry he wrote during this period. Tonight, she wears a sealskin cape, glistening black diamonds, where the water swathes her thighs, and noxious glints conspire to surprise a pulse, condoning eagerness with rape. In the winter of 1923-24, he wrote what he called my first love poem, to honor that most beautiful lady who is writing a thesis on Spinoza. He contemplates this mystery woman from afar in the library, but apparently never speaks to her. No, I know that there have been others who have read Spinoza, even I. Others who have crossed their white arms across the number of pages. Others too pure to glance, even a second, beyond the sacred sphincter of their erudition. But what is all that to me? You must come, I say, and see the seagulls, gold in the late sun. You must come and talk to me and tell me why, in this same world, little white puffs of cloud-like cotton batting, if you will, or lingerie, I have heard that before. Little white puffs of cloud should float so quietly across the cleanly sky, and you should sit, pale, in a black dress that would have graced the stern ascetic conscience of a Benedict, and read Spinoza, and let the wind blow the clouds by, and let me drown myself in an ecstasy of death. Well, what if I do forget? Forget Spinoza and your constancy. Forget everything, till it stays with me. Only a faint half hope and half regret, and the unnumbered stretches of the sea. Unable to initiate a relationship, he remained aloof, hoping, as the poem says, that the young woman would make the first move. "You must come and talk to me." He feels a faint, half hope and half regret. Such a mix of powerful emotions are not, of course, unusual for a young man coming of age. But Robert had to be told that he was not alone. Again and again, whenever he was in anguish, Robert turned to his old teacher for help. In the late winter of 1924, he wrote Smith in the great distress of some emotional crisis. That letter has not survived, but we have Robert's reply to Smith's letter of reassurance. "What has soothed me most, I think," he told Smith, "is that you perceived in my distress a certain similarity to that from which you had suffered. It had never occurred to me that the situation of anyone who now appeared to me in all respects so impeccable and so enviable could be in any way comparable with my own. Abstractly, I feel that it is a terrible pity that there should be so many good people I shall not know, so many joys missed. But you are right. At least for me, the desire is not a need. It is an impertinence." After Robert finished his first year at Harvard, his father found him a summer job in a New Jersey laboratory. But he was bored. "The job and people are bourgeois and lazy and dead," he wrote Francis Ferguson, who was himself back in lovely Los Pinos. "There is little work and nothing to puzzle at. How I envy you. Francis, you choke me with anguish and despair. All I can do is admit to my hierarchy of physico-chemical immutabilities the Chaucerian amour, vincit omnia." Robert's friends were used to this florid language. "Everything he takes up," Francis later observed, "he exaggerates." Paul Horgan, too, recalled Robert's Baroque tendency to exaggerate. But it was also true that he quit the lab job and spent the month of August back at Bay Shore, much of the time sailing with Horgan, who had agreed to spend his vacation with him. In June 1925, after only 3 years of study, Robert graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in chemistry. He made the dean's list and was one of only 30 students to be selected for membership in Phi Beta Kappa. Tongue-in-cheek, he wrote Herbert Smith that year, "Even in the last stages of senile aphasia, I will not say that education, in an academic sense, was only secondary when I was at college. I plow through about 5 or 10 big scientific books a week and pretend to research. Even if, in the end, I've got to satisfy myself with testing toothpaste, I don't want to know it till it has happened." Testing toothpaste was hardly a likely future for a Harvard senior who that year had taken such courses as colloid chemistry, history of England from 1688 to the present time, introduction to the theory of potential functions and Laplace's equation, the analytical theory of heat and problems of inelastic vibrations, and mathematical theory of electricity and magnetism. But decades later, he would look back on his undergraduate years and confess, "Although I liked to work, I spread myself very thin and got by with murder. I got A's in all these courses, which I don't think I should have." He thought he had acquired a very quick, superficial, eager familiarization with some parts of physics, with tremendous lacunae, and often with a tremendous lack of practice and discipline. Skipping the commencement ceremonies, Robert and 2 friends, William C. Boyd and Frederick Bernheim, celebrated privately with laboratory alcohol in a dorm room. "Boyd and I got plastered," Bernheim recalled. "Robert, I think, only took 1 drink and retired." Later that weekend, Robert took Boyd to the summer house in Bay Shore and sailed his beloved Trimothy to Fire Island. "We took off our clothes," Boyd remembered, and walked up and down the beach getting a sunburn. Robert could have stayed at Harvard. He was offered a graduate fellowship, but he already had loftier ambitions. He had graduated as a chemistry major, but it was physics that called him, and he knew that in the world of physics, Cambridge, England, was more near the center. Hoping that the eminent English physicist, Ernest Rutherford, celebrated as the man who had first developed a model of the nuclear atom in 1911, would take him under his wing, Robert persuaded his physics teacher, Percy Bridgman, to write a letter of recommendation. In his letter, Bridgman wrote candidly that Oppenheimer had a perfectly prodigious power of assimilation, but that his weakness was on the experimental side. His type of mind is analytical rather than physical, and he is not at home in the manipulations of the laboratory. It appears to me that it is a bit of a gamble as to whether Oppenheimer will ever make any real contributions of an important character. But if he does make good at all, I believe he will be a very unusual success. Bridgman then closed with remarks, not unusual for that time and place, on Oppenheimer's Jewish background. As appears from his name, Oppenheimer is a Jew, but entirely without the usual qualifications of his race. He is a tall, well-set-up young man with a rather engaging diffidence of manner, and I think you need have no hesitation whatever for any reason of this sort in considering his application. With the hope that Bridgman's recommendation would gain him admittance to Rutherford's laboratory, Robert spent the month of August in his beloved New Mexico. At 69 years of age, Thomson, who had won the 1906 Nobel Prize in Physics for his detection of the electron, was well past his prime as a working physicist. In 1919, he had resigned his administrative responsibilities, and by 1925, he came into the laboratory sporadically and tutored only the occasional student. Robert was nonetheless greatly relieved when he learned that Thomson had agreed to supervise his studies. He had chosen physics as his vocation, and he was confident that its future, and his, lay in Europe.
As Chapter 2 of American Prometheus comes to a close, we find ourselves further immersed in the awe-inspiring journey of our American hero. We've witnessed their resilience, accomplishments, and the challenges they've faced along the way. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll continue to unravel the captivating tapestry of their life and legacy. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when the next chapter unfolds. Until then, keep the flame of curiosity burning, and we'll see you in the next episode as we uncover more of the story of American Prometheus.